Once, when the lawn was a golden green, and the marbled moonlit trees rose like fresh memorials in the scented air, and the whole countryside pulsed with the chirr and murmur of insects, I lay in the grass feeling the great distances open above me, and wondered what I would become and where I would find myself. And though I barely existed, I felt for an instant that the vast star-clustered sky was mine, and I heard my name as if for the first time, heard it the way one hears the wind or the rain, but faint and far off, as though it belonged not to me, but to the silence from which it had come and to which it would go.
Siamo qui per parlare della sua opera di poeta, l'opera di un poeta definito della montagna e del mare, con tratti peculiari che lo differenziano da altri poeti suoi contemporanei, anche statunitensi. Lei, come altri scrittori, è capitato anche ad altri scrittori, si era avviato alla pittura, scoprendo poi a un certo punto di dedicarsi solamente alla scrittura. È successo ad Orhan Pamuk, premio Nobel per la letteratura nel 2006, ed è accaduto anche a lei nel 1957. A 24 anni ha deciso di vivere da poeta. Ci racconta com'è andata e che ricordi ha dei suoi esordi letterari.
Well, I'd always read poetry, even though I was painting. I was an art student. I wasn't really a painter. I was merely a student painter. But in some way, being an art student prepared me for writing because I had a certain sense of the formality of the enterprise. I shaped pictures, now I was shaping poems. A kind of inner harmony had to exist between the first line, the middle, the end. Just as in a painting, everything fits together. I gave up painting because I realized I wasn't a very good painter. And though I turned to poetry, I wasn't a very good poet. But I felt the possibility of becoming better as a poet. There are other reasons why. I mean, in my family, books were very important. And I'd often felt delinquent as a reader and deficient as a writer. And suddenly I felt the need to compensate for those delinquencies and deficiencies by writing. And it began as a way of responding to the wishes or hopes of my parents.
La sua prima poesia, quella scritta negli anni 60, sembra dominata dalla pittura di Edward Hopper, su cui lei ha anche scritto poi una monografia. Ecco, ci spiega come entra l'opera di un grande artista visivo quale fu Hopper nella sua opera di poesia.
You know, it wasn't really the paintings that influenced me at the beginning so much as writers like Kafka, Borges, Calvino. These were the writers who interested me, none of whom was really a poet except for Borges, but they wrote a prose that had a great deal of intensity and density, and were in touch with what we all now acknowledge as the uncanny, the strange, the unexpected. And I was fascinated by that in their work. I was also fascinated by the work of the surrealists because they specialized in the unexpected and the irrational. And of course, you can't write and make sense and be irrational. You have to be able to transform irrationality into something that has a shape. In other words, you have to allow the reader to experience the irrational not in a programmed way, but in a formal way. Because our lives are lived not rationally by and large, but our lives are dominated by accident, and we're motivated by irrational forces very often that we don't understand. We're driven to do this, driven to do that. Sometimes against our own better interests. And these internal contradictions are things that I wanted to explore in my work and to which I was drawn in the work of others.
Via via negli anni la sua identità poetica sembra si sia dedicata a un esercizio di purificazione interiore. L'uomo che cammina un passo davanti al buio è il titolo della raccolta in cui per la prima volta viene proposta qui in Italia un'ampia scelta della sua produzione poetica. Chi è quest'uomo che cammina un passo avanti al buio?
He's a representative of everybody. It's not a particular person. It's not even me, although I feel I'm walking one step ahead of the dark, especially as I get older. The dark keeps getting closer. But it's everybody's fate to stay one step ahead of the dark. You know, one can think of it this way, that every day one lives, or every day that one survives, one has escaped the dark. And it's in that sense that I meant the title of my book in Italian. No more, I mean.
Tutta la sua opera sembra dominata, almeno così è stato detto, dal tema dell'attesa. C'è qualcosa che non avviene, ma che poi accadrà. Ecco, come definirebbe la sua poesia?
I can't define my poetry. I don't think it's my job. It's true that there are certain themes that run through my poetry. Expectation, that is waiting, disappointment, the encroaching dark. But, when I write, I don't have any of those things in mind. And I don't think of my work as a totality, ever. I think of the individual poem that I'm working on. And once the poem is written, I don't think about it anymore. I've gotten rid of it. And I can move on to another poem. But if I thought I had themes that I should come back to again and again, I'd be paralyzed. I'd be the prisoner of an abstract notion of what I was doing. It would be the death of me. Good.
Ok. Lei potrebbe essere definito anche il poeta della disillusione, forse questa è una delle principali caratteristiche della sua opera. Lei dice che l'immaginazione è come se fosse svanita o come se si fosse affievolita. Ecco, l'uomo contemporaneo ha perso l'immaginazione, la creatività. Perché è accaduto questo?
Well, I think of myself as a comic poet. I think of my poems as humorous. I think of Man and Camel as a rather humorous poem in which the man and the camel in the poem turn against the poet for having interpreted what they mean. And so that's why they come back at the end and say, you've ruined it forever, meaning the poem. It's the poem avenging itself on the poet. But, I mean, a man and a camel singing is ridiculous. You know, a man and a camel suddenly appearing, I mean, to tell you the truth, I had an image of a man and a camel, and I thought, how can I get these two together in a poem? What can I do with a man and a camel in a poem? And so I invented this little story, which I thought was funny. But disillusionment is too strong. I mean, I don't feel disillusioned. I mean, I feel disillusionment sometimes, but who doesn't? You know, I think if you read my poems closely, they become more and more humorous. Good questions. Had me thinking.
Possiamo dunque dire che l'uomo che cammina un passo avanti al buio, è l'uomo contemporaneo che cammina in uno spazio oscuro che precede il buio che concluderà la sua esistenza.
Well, you know, um, the man who walks one step ahead of the dark is not walking through the dark. He's walking in the light. The fact that the dark is behind him and may be catching up is one thing. But if he were in the dark and the dark were pursuing him, one wouldn't be able to make the distinction that I make. We live in a blessed condition of illumination. But the illumination or the light would not mean anything unless we had a sense of the dark. It's as simple as that. But, I mean, everything isn't dark. I mean, clearly, look at today. It's a beautiful day. It would be ridiculous if I said, we live in the dark. You know. Ideologically, maybe we live in darker times, but then darkness becomes a figure of speech. You know. Good.
È stato detto di lei il poeta dell'assenza. Il suo è un io che si sottrae al paesaggio. La sua è una poesia semplice ma anche misteriosa. Il suo dire io non è un'autoaffermazione ma una negazione, è un cancellare il sé, perché ci sono molti vuoti, tante sospensioni. Ecco perché tante sospensioni all'interno della sua poesia.
I don't know. I simply don't know. I have a feeling that when one sits in a room alone and is writing, one loses his or her connection to the world and becomes the secretary of one's thoughts. And there is a kind of disembodiment that takes over. So you lose a sense of time, your sense of space is altered, and you are the creature of your imagination. Now, the idea of absence and mystery, what I'm saying is the absence of the real world is palpable when one is alone in a room. The mysterious is something that is inexplicable. Otherwise, it would not be mysterious. It's where these ideas come from and what the poem tells you about where it wishes to go. All of that is mysterious because in some sense, I'm not telling the poem where to go. The poem is urging me on as though the poem had a voice of its own and I were the secretary of my voice. And my voice were the product of my imagination. Other than that, I really can't say, except that I prefer to live in the mystery and the absence, if that is what this is.
È stato detto di lei il poeta dell'assenza, lo abbiamo detto, ma anche il poeta pastorale, del genere pastorale, idilliaco, ma non nel senso proprio del termine, nel senso che la sua poesia si colloca in uno spazio idealizzato e artificiale che rende per questa ragione forse più intensa la sofferenza, tanto che la critica parla di idillio negativo di M.Strand. Lei è d'accordo con questa interpretazione? E quali sono i suoi paesaggi?
Well, I'm willing to agree with that characterization of my poetry. I never heard it before because I don't read criticism of my work. I don't read reviews. People tell me it's good, fine, or it's bad. I don't say fine, I say who cares. But yes, I think I create the sort of this idealized negativity is a possibility. The landscape, or the environment within my poems is really decor. The mountains that appear are background. The sea that appears is just background. The moon is background. What interests me is the action that takes place within the poem. For me, the image of a poem is the act within the poem. It's the evolution of consciousness within the constraints, within the formal constraints of the poem. And whether this suggests pain or pleasure, I don't know. I can only say that in writing these poems, I experience pleasure. Whether I transmit pain, and I'm sure one does, it's very difficult. It's a difficult question. You see, look at all the thousands of crucifixions that have been painted. They are the crucifixion is the example of utmost pain, it seems to me. Yet we look at these paintings, whether they be by Velázquez or Tintoretto or even Salvador Dali, we experience pleasure. The pain is not transmitted. We have to reimagine the pain through the pleasure that's transmitted. Actually, I have a poem that I've written about this very process that becomes, it's one of the most mysterious, most poems are about loss and are sad. But that sadness and that loss we equate with beauty. And it's the beauty that moves us.
Nella raccolta Uomo e Cammello, lei paragona l'essere umano a una città che è sul punto di avverarsi, una città però che non riesce a compiersi. Accade in Conversazione, che è una sua poesia. Ecco, l'uomo appare sempre in balia delle forze contrastanti fra ciò che è e ciò che sarebbe potuto essere. Lei scrive in Poesia delle ultime 7 parole: sentiamo che potremmo vivere per sempre e nel contempo sappiamo che non si può. È davvero questa la nostra condizione?
Sì, è vero. We wake up each day not believing that this will be our last day unless we're very sick. There's something in us that believes there will always be a next, another day. At the same time, we know that this will stop. Intellectually, we know that it will be over, but the body wakes up. The body doesn't know it's going to be over. The body wakes up and you get out of bed, you stand up, you take a shower, the day begins, and that it could be your last day never occurs to you. So we have the awareness that we cannot live forever, and yet we live as though we were going to live forever. Imagine waking up every day and thinking, today is the day I will die. We're not, psychologically, physically, we do not allow ourselves to do that.
Nella poesia Uomo e Cammello, lei dice che l'armonia fra l'uomo e il cammello, che sono probabilmente l'immagine dell'armonia in un deserto, è compromessa ancora da forze contrastanti tra ciò che è e ciò che dovrebbe essere. Chi ha interrotto l'armonia tra gli esseri viventi?
Harmony of the man and the camel in the desert was an invention. It's not a reality. It's a proposition in the poem. It's an image in the poem. Interrupted by the poet who chooses to interpret the happiness or the harmony of the man and the camel in the desert. The poet says this exemplifies all ideal couples, something like that. That interjecting meaning, interpreting what he created, is a way of denying the man and the camel in the desert a certain primacy. So the poet both created the harmony and disrupted the harmony. He ruined it. He ruined it forever. The poem knows that. It's a metaphysical poem.
La sua poesia inoltre opera quasi un paradosso perché supera il confine, i confini tra vita e morte e incarna l'essenza della poesia. D'altra parte la grandissima poesia, la grande poesia trascende la morte. Lei condivide questa interpretazione?
Well, I think poems transcend death for a little while. Great poems for a long time. But most poems die when the poet dies, or 5 years after the poet dies. Or maybe if the poet is lucky, although he wouldn't know it because he'd be dead, 20 years after his death. The idea that poems are immortal and live forever is mistaken. There's no room for so many poems. People keep writing new poems. Let's put it this way. The world can only contain 100 poems. Only the 100 best poems. Those are the poems by the great poets. M.Strand comes along and knocks at the door and says, I have a poem. I want it in this room with the 100 great poems. Will you let me in? A voice from above says, not this poem. A few years later, M.Strand knocks at the door and says, I have another poem. Will you let me in? The voice says, we'll let you in for 10 minutes, but we have to move another poem out. So M.Strand's poem moves into the room with the 100 poems, and one of the 100 poems leaves. But then the voice, whether it's God or the public or literary criticism, says, I made a mistake. M.Strand's poem cannot stay in this room. Bring that other poem back. So it's a little like that. You know, the transcendence of poetry is a very iffy business. You have to be a very great poet to have your poems continue. I mean, you have to be a Derek Walcott or, Brodsky in this late 20th century, or Adam Zagajewski, but he's still young, we don't know. He might not have knocked at the door yet. Maybe in a few years he'll knock at the door, I don't know. Good.
La grandezza della sua poesia sta anche nel fatto che è una lingua fortemente ritmica. Ecco, qual è il rapporto fra il canto della poesia e la musica?
Well, I don't want to suggest there's a real relationship between music and poetry as poetry. For poetry to be recognizably poetry, or recognizably poetic, it has to have a cadence. A cadence helps one to remember what one hears. You know, songs are different because song lyrics depend on music. Poems have to do it alone. They create their own internal music. And I think it's a way to allow them, poems need meter or cadence or rhythm to help them remain in the mind of the reader for a little longer than it takes to read the poem. One remembers more easily when there's a rhythm. It's simple as that.
Perché c'è bisogno, secondo lei, di ricordare i grandi poeti come lo fu Brodsky? E cosa offrono i poeti all'umanità e che cosa e perché si sente tanto la mancanza della poesia?
Well, a great poet like Brodsky reminds us what it feels like to be alive. Because we forget. We take living and experiencing for granted. But when you read Brodsky, suddenly experience is charged with meaning. And we're reminded of what living is like, feeling is like, thinking is like, shaping an attitude is like, honoring another is like. Now, I don't know whether there are great poets today or not. I suspect that there are. I suspect that there are always great poets. I don't think we've seen the end of great poetry. It's amazing that poetry, which is a very old art, should continue. More and more students want to study poetry, want to study writing poetry, than ever before, when the opportunities for more immediate forms of gratification are there. The movies, television, you know, loud thumping music, you know. But in some way, human beings want to be reminded of what it's like to be a human being. And movies, television avoid the issue of what it's like to be human. They show us human beings walking around doing terrible things to each other, but not what it's like to be inside a human being.
Come definirebbe il momento storico che stiamo attraversando qui in Italia, ma volgendo anche lo sguardo più in là e penso alla rivolta del Maghreb con la caduta dei regimi dittatoriali, ma penso anche alla tragedia del Giappone, al problema del nucleare.
Well, you could say I could say this is the end of the world, although I don't think it is. I think in some ways civilization has gotten ahead of itself, say in the nuclear. We don't have adequate safeguards against the technology that we've invented for ourselves. So nuclear reactors will break down and radioactivity will saturate a particular area and people will die. And it's a tragedy. But people are driven to find easier and cheaper ways to heat their homes, to, you know, to move their cars, whatever it is. As far as the social revolutions here, everywhere, it means that billions of people are very unhappy. And very few people are really happy. You can't live in a world, you can't live your whole life thinking that other people are living in luxury and you have nothing. You know, that's got to stop at some point. And, you know, we live in a time where the inequities are so great and so visible that demonstrations of anger are bound to occur. And I think we're seeing maybe the breakup of oligarchic forms of government and maybe the creation of new democratic forms. We may even be seeing the end of capitalism as we know it. We may be entering an age when we experience a compromise between capitalism and socialism, where we have social democracies. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a political scientist. But we may be seeing the end of a way of life for many people and the beginning of a new one.
Lei si sente un uomo libero come poeta?
Sì, assolutamente. I am very grateful to have spent my life doing very little but writing poetry. I feel lucky. Very few people get to be 70 years old and say, I've done just the right thing. I've done what I should have done. Most people get to be 70 and say to themselves, where has it gone? What have I done? Why didn't I do what I wanted to do 50 years ago and take that other road? So yes, I feel very grateful.
La letteratura è un collante tra le diverse culture. Secondo lei è ancora possibile oggi? E chi sono e quali sono gli scrittori che incontra? E soprattutto c'è una società delle nazioni che riguarda la letteratura?
Well, in a way, yes. In a way, thanks to translation. But the internationalization of poetry and the creation of a nation of poets is wholly dependent on translation. And some languages are more dominant than others. And in order for, say, if you write in Serbian, you're going to need somebody to translate you into English or Chinese in order to experience a kind of, in order to think of yourself as being in the world of poetry, the wider world of poetry. Poets are related despite national boundaries and languages because they're committed to the internal life of man. Poets say there is more than breakfast, lunch, and dinner. There's another life that we live. It's the subjective life. It's the life of feeling and the life of thought. For a poet, what we feel about breakfast, lunch, and dinner is as important as breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You know, we are able to understand poets of 2,000 years ago because the themes of poetry have really not changed. A man walks out into the night 2,000 years ago and is afraid of the dark. A man or a woman today walks out into the night and experiences fear of the dark. It's the same fear. It's a human fear. And we have to be reminded that this is a human thing. Instead of denying it all the time, saying, as if we were born yesterday, as if we were invented by a technological world.
Nella poesia Le variazioni Webern, lei scrive: e tutto trasmuta, e trasmuta, e l'ignoto trasmuta nel canto, che è ciò che è noto, ma cosa a sua volta ne sia del canto, non sta a noi dirlo. Dove inizia la poesia e dove finisce?
Well, it ends with a mystery. I mean, everything turns and turns, and the unknown turns into something. This is what poets do. They take the unknown and they make it visible. What was not suspected about ourselves or was not known about ourselves suddenly is known. And then, but what in turn becomes of the song or the poem is not for us to say. It's for history or the future to tell us. We can only make something from nothing and hope that what we make does not turn back into nothing, but we don't know. Eventually, of course, it will turn into nothing. As I said, there's only room for 100 of these poems. You know, it sounds very sad, the end of this poem, but it's simply a statement of fact. I mean, it's another way of saying we don't know what the future will bring. We don't know what the future will say. We don't know how the future will judge us. Simple as that.
Grazie.
And everything turns and turns, and the unknown turns into the song that is the known, but what in turn becomes of the song is not for us to say.